In this video, we will discuss the context of the Johannine Epistles. When we talk about the Johannine Epistles, we're talking about the epistles attributed to John the Evangelist. Now, John the Evangelist is a separate person from John the Baptist we see in the Gospels. John the Evangelist is often believed to be the writer of the Gospel of John, the 1st through 3rd epistles of John, as well as the book of Revelation. We've talked about the Gospel of John and its authorship earlier in this semester, so now we're going to turn our attention to the Johannine epistles. Of course, we must first ask with this epistle, who wrote it? While the epistle carries the name of John in the title, remember that these titles were added on later. The text never claims to be written by John. Instead, the author seems to be anonymous and is referred to as the elder. Later church historians attributed this text to John the Evangelist because the opening that we see here is similar to the opening of the Gospel of John, and also because the focus is on Jesus' commandment of loving other people, just like we see in the Gospel of John. More than likely, the author of this text was simply an elder in the Johannine community. We see this emphasis on we rather than I from the author, which indicates that this may have been written by a person speaking on behalf of a group of people. The epistle was probably written between the 90s and the early 2nd century CE. Irenaeus cites 1 John directly around 180, so we know that this text could not have been written any later than that. It was probably written much further before, simply because Irenaeus could quote it directly rather than paraphrase or simply reference it. Most scholars think that it postdates the Gospel of John because the change from the focus on angry Jews into a focus on schism, which we see in this epistle. The audience of this epistle is a Christian community, particularly one struggling with schisms within itself. Now, we call this the first epistle of John, but if you look at the text, you might notice that some of the customary greetings, closings, and just normal features of a letter are missing from this text, unlike some of the letters we see from Paul. Most scholars think that this is not actually a letter because there is no letter structure. There's also no central argument like Paul has. Some scholars argue that this may have been a working document that over time was tweaked and added onto. The intention of this letter is first to address false teachings. The false teachings that we see throughout this epistle are not quite clear. Some believe that Docetism, Gnosticism, or even interpretations of the Gospel of John are in focus by the author. Any of these so-called false teachings would fit with the focus that we see in the epistle. The author focuses on people who left the community because they denied Jesus' messiahship, his physical body, or the fact that his death led to salvation for his followers. The epistle also encourages those listening to love each other. This is in light of the schism the church is having and the division between the two groups, those who are leaving and those who are still in the church. And the author claims that the division is so bad that it's equivalent to Cain's fratricide, killing his brother Abel. The epistle also uses apocalypticism to focus on this schism, talking about antichrists, which is plural here, which we can note interestingly when we get to the book of Revelation later, eternal life, false prophets, and even Satan in the last days. When we turn to the second epistle of John, we see that the author is probably the same as the first epistle of John. Again, this is probably not John the Evangelist or John the Apostle, but rather simply some elder in a Johannine community. The date for this text is probably around the same time as 1 John, though some scholars note that this was probably written a bit before the first epistle of John was written. In the first epistle, we see a focus on the schism and the split in the church, but some scholars note that the text of 2nd epistle of John does not focus on a split or break as much as some tensions within the church. They argue that the split has not quite happened yet, and may happen later because there is a schism in the area that the elder, as the author of this text, is in, and this is probably in Ephesus. Again, this is addressed to a particular Christian community, probably a Johannine community who's been taught the Johannine writings and gospel. The intention is again to push back against false teachings, and there's much more brief instruction here than we see in the first epistle of John. Some scholars claim that this letter may have been combined with 1 John to be sent to these various churches around Asia Minor. 2nd epistle also indicates that the elder would be coming to visit the church that he is writing to. And again, we see this as a letter structure, unlike 1 John. Finally, we get to the 3rd epistle of John. This epistle does not seem to be as well known and used as 1st and 2nd John were in the 2nd, 3rd, and so on centuries by early church writers. Again, we see the author being the same elder, and based on the language that we see, most scholars claim that the elder who wrote this text also wrote 1st and 2nd John. In fact, the closing to this epistle is exactly the same as the closing to the 2nd epistle of John. Some scholars believe that this was written before the 2nd John. There's no mention of the schism that we see in 2nd John, briefly mentioned or elaborated on in 1 John. Unlike the other texts, which are addressed to general church communities, this text is addressed specifically to Gaius. What we see here is a focus on Diotrephes, who is supposedly refusing to give hospitality to other Christians who are traveling from place to place. The idea, of course, is that hospitality is one of the most important things in both Christianity and Judaism at this point. Additionally, Christians would prefer to stay with other Christians to avoid persecution and to have better experiences on their travels. However, Diotrephes was supposedly refusing this hospitality to these other Christians, even though he himself was a Christian. The elder of this epistle seems to write to Gaius to ask for support, and the support was first not to follow Diotrephes' teachings of not offering this hospitality, and second, to encourage Gaius to offer hospitality to traveling Christians. Now that we've reached the end of this video, you should be able to explain the authorship, composition date, audience, and authorial intent of the Johannine Epistles, describe the historical setting and context of the Johannine Epistles, and identify the themes in the Johannine Epistles and give examples of how they are used in the text.